Hello, everyone. My name is Eileen Vanessa, and together with the co author of this chapter, Mandy Berry, I have the joy of welcoming you to one of the most difficult academic genres, at least to me, a short talk. A short talk which provokes your thinking about the nature of teacher educator knowledge and practice as we promoted in this chapter without taking away the need to actually go and read the chapter. And I have to apologize for not joining you live, but I'm currently located in Belgium and I'm not as equipped to engage in an academic discussion in the middle of the night than I was perhaps 10 years ago. Um, anyway, the chapter opens with an extended example from Mandy's own self study into her practice as a biology teacher educator. Our intention here is not imposing the norm for good teacher education or good self-study. Rather, we use her work as a window into how teacher educator knowledge is conceptualized and practiced in self-study, and we also use it as a way to problematize the dominant way of seeing teacher educator knowledge in policy and research. In the example, we don't see a teacher educator who's fully in control of the effects that her actions will take in practice. We also don't see a teacher educator who works from a clearly defined plan that is fully laid out in advance and then carried out in practice. I think we see a teacher educator who we don't see very often in policy or the research community. That's a teacher educator who is struggling, doubting about what to do next, questioning the effectiveness of what has been done. We see a teacher educator who cannot but make a dozen of decisions about how to act while lacking an ultimate high heart ground to base their decisions on, and you might feel a sense of relief at this stage. We use Mandy's experiences to introduce the readers to the central argument in our chapter that the work of the S-STEP community as a whole complicates some of our traditional notions of teacher educator knowledge. If you look at this in more detail, policy and research tends to talk about teacher educator knowledge as an individual quality. Knowledge is something that individuals acquire, possess, and then perform. You are a professional or not. The assumption also is that knowledge is fairly context free and stable, and that it moves with the knowledgeable individual from one situation to the other. Knowledge in research and policy is largely seen as technical. The emphasis is on developing and then maintaining teacher educators who know what works and who know how to reproduce what works in their practices and pedagogies with student teachers. If you look at knowledge this way, it can also be mapped and it can be checked, for instance, using a professional standard, which is becoming commonplace in many countries in light of the awakening to the importance of the work that teacher educators do. Such a standard is a presumably exhaustive list of all the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that individual teacher educators need to master or at least actively work towards in order to consider themselves professionals. It defines what is considered good, acceptable professional behavior, but more importantly, it also shapes and defines who is the knower about teaching and teacher education and what justifies claims to know something about it. According to this logic, the knower is largely the author of the standard. In most cases, a group of researchers or expert teacher educators who draw on evidence based research agendas to try to find the variables of effective teaching, and then individual teachers can use or perhaps apply these variables and these insights and understandings in their practice. Mandy's work and the work of the S-STEP community as a whole makes clear that it's not that easy. Teacher educators have to deal with problems that cannot be solved by simply upscaling their individual competencies. It's much more complicated than that, and that's why I sometimes pity us, teacher educators. Building on this, we contend that S-STEP opens up a different way of seeing teacher educator knowledge than what we just presented. We argue that self-study keeps the complexity of educating teachers in place, in that it offers a conception of knowledge as that which is enacted in practice, at a very particular moment in time in a very particular context. That's where it happens in unique ways. The teacher educator practice does not exist. The only thing that exists is your practice and that of your colleagues in specific context in relation to that other curious species in the room, students. So, knowledge in self study is not so much a fixed state that can be achieved by individuals, but it's something that constantly develops from experience and that only becomes visible or real in practice, in relationship with the others present in that practice, which we tend to forget about when we think about success in teacher education or failure in teacher education as something that comes from the individual knowledge or the knowledge of individual teacher educators. We develop this argument further by showing how self-study not only offers such a different conception of teacher-educator knowledge, but also delivers a methodology to tap into this knowledge and fundamentally redefine the relationship between the knower and the known. From a conception of knowledge as enacted in practice, the key objective of research is not for researchers to know what teacher-educators know, but for teacher-educators to know what they themselves know. And I wish those words would have been ours, but they're from Venstermacher. In the next section, and we're now almost halfway through the chapter, we move on to consider how the nature of S-STEP as a methodology allows for the opening up and the making of such enacted, complex, relational, constantly evolving knowledge. Drawing on a review of the literature since Vicky Labosky's foundational chapter in the very first edition of the handbook, we highlight 5 essential characteristics of self-study methodology and bring these to life with recent examples of work. 1. S-STEP starts and ends with practice. 2. It speaks to a broad understanding of improvement in teacher education, not limiting itself to a technical improvement agenda of what works or what doesn't work in teacher education. 3. It is inquiry deeply situated in very particular biographical, temporal, physical, social, cultural, political settings, which all shape our actions and interactions in practice. 4. Self-study doesn't just happen overnight, but it is intentional and reflective. And 5, it draws on interaction with others. And I won't go into further detail here because of the genre we're in, so a short presentation, but also because I don't want to take away your interest in reading the chapter. In the final section of the chapter, we demonstrate that this complex, evolving, situated nature of knowledge developed through self-study should not be read as a sign that we need to give up the ambition to develop a public knowledge base for teacher education, nor that we should reduce that ambition to a notion of knowledge in practice, something so individualized and localized that it cannot be mapped on a more systematic basis. The profession needs to develop a shared language, but the nature of that language will require a bit of work so that it allows to capture both the conceptual and the local, both the general theory and practice. Drawing on recent examples of self-study, we discuss how the technical representations developed through self-study, the knowledge representations, developed through self-study, might actually serve as the beginning of such a language. We are referring here to the language of paradoxes, axioms, tensions, assumptions, assertions, or principles of learning to teach teachers. All of these suggest that there are no easy answers in teacher education. Paradoxes or tensions cannot be solved. Assumptions or principles cannot be simply applied in practice. And that's exactly why these knowledge representations are so interesting. They don't sidestep the question of judgment about what constitutes high-quality teacher education. They hold on to ambivalence and contradiction rather than reducing or solving it, as happens often in our more conventional way of seeing teacher educator knowledge. In doing so, these knowledge representations effectively position the reader of a self-study as a professional himself, who needs to make sense of these complexities in his own practice or her own practice and decide how to act on them. As a conclusion to this chapter, we encourage the community to continue to do what it's best at. That's focusing on understanding, a broad understanding of improvement in teacher education, not falling prey to a technicist agenda of improvement. Without this, self-study risks becoming one of the many strategies to simply become more skillful through experience, confirming the status quo, furthering a rather narrow, instrumentalist and accountability-driven research agenda, and unintentionally supporting the further deprofessionalization of teaching and teacher education. And those words do not come from Fenstermacher, they're ours. At the same time, however, it's not enough that we S-STEP researchers perfect our practice and that we become better at what we do. It will also be important to learn how to speak other people's languages and to effectively communicate our work to the broader research community, to policymakers, and also to practitioners, while staying true to the nature of our work and the research about that work. Thank you. I hope this provides you with enough courage to actually read the chapter, and feel free to get in touch with any questions or reflections you might want to share. Thank you.